Hi, we come to the mysterious and fascinating scene of the woman clothed with the sun with the moon under her feet and on her head a crown of 12 stars in Revelation 12 today. And numerous questions abound, and really we can't dig into the text until we answer some of them. Like, for instance, who is this woman? And what does this chapter have to do with the scenes around us? Is this Our Lady of Guadalupe? Is this Jesus' mother in some other form? What's going on here, and how does this image fit with the witnesses and that preceded, and with the persecution under the hands of the dragon and the beast that follows? So fortunately, that question of how it fits in can be addressed by the chiasm that we've been looking at from Tony Hsu's book, The War Between the Two Beasts and the Two Witnesses, where he shows very clearly in his long doctoral dissertation that he's adapted for publication how these chapters from 11:1 to 14:5 fit perfectly together and make sense of our scene here in chapter 12, and we're only going to look at the first 4 verses today, but how that part fits at the center between the two other chapters and forms its own chiasm within the other two chiasms. I want to note as I do this that not every chiasm is equal. One of the things I like about Hsu's work, and I try to emulate it in my own work going back 30 years now in my work on the Gospel of John back in the early 90s, was to make sure that chiasms actually made sense and were helpful, not to find them when they're not there or to impose them upon the text. And Hsu is very good at both naming that as principle and showing it in what he does. But I want to highlight, if you're interested in chiasms and looking around, not all are equal. For instance, this one here, from these authors, William Shea and Ed Christian, the chiastic structure of Revelation 12:1 to 15:4, purporting to do almost the exact same thing but a chapter later. And I really don't think it holds together. If you read it carefully through, they really force it, the parallels there, and I don't think it works. So hopefully you're seeing not just the results of Hsu, but at least some evidence that I can show you of how these things fit together. So that's one thing to know. And another thing to know is that when we jump down to look at 12:6, which we won't look at today, we'll see that the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared for 1,260 days. And that is parallel to the 42 months that we saw in chapter 11 and the times and half a time we're going to see later. And we looked at that last video and the video before. So what that is telling us here is that what we're seeing in chapter 12 is simultaneous with what we saw in chapter 11, the witnesses in the street of the great city who die but are raised from the dead, and then that leads some out of fear to give glory to the God of heaven. And then what follows in 13, including the demonic liturgy there, where people worship the dragon and the beast, saying, who is like the beast and who can fight against it? These are not sequential things, other than the fact that John was writing on a document that had to be in some order. But they're simultaneous in the same way that if you were to read a newspaper, those who remember newspapers, or more likely to scroll on the internet for the news in one way or the other, you could read, for example, when I'm doing this video right now, the Russian war in Ukraine is going on, climate change is going on, and major questions of democracy in the United States are going on. Those are all happening at the same time, of course, and we can read stories about each one of them as if they're in isolation, but as people in the world that we're a part of, we know that those things are all happening at the same time, even if we give certain attention to one or another. Similarly, in the world of John's vision here, that the witness in the street of the great city and the celebration of the death of those who are tormenting the inhabitants of the earth is happening simultaneously with this engagement between the woman and the dragon, and also between the dragon's representatives, the beasts, in the next chapter. That's an important thing to be paying attention to, how this fits in, both in terms of its narrative context and in terms of time. But we also need to address who is this. And if there's any part of Revelation that's subject to visual imagery, it's this. Let's look at a couple of examples. Here's the classic from Durr of the woman clothed with the sun and the dragon. And that's familiar if you've seen other of my videos, or at least seen other images of Durr, the style he does. Perhaps more familiar to others, especially perhaps to Catholics, although this is not a Catholic story as such, it's a biblical story, is this one. Because this one looks, of course, a lot like what people associate with Jesus' mother Mary, whatever she looks like, because, of course, there's no description of what she looks like in the Bible at all, any more than there is of Jesus. But here, as a white racial face and as a classic European style, this is perhaps what some people are seeing here. In contrast with this one, which is a classic Greek Orthodox icon. So also in icon form. The features vary according to the artistic style there, not according to the biblical text. So 3 relatively classic ways of looking at it. One of the common misunderstandings that people make is to associate this woman with the Mexican-American story of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Mexican-American, only Mexican story, but because so many Mexican-Americans and other Latin Americans in the United States and elsewhere who migrated around have brought that story with them. And of course, it's a story about migration and colonialization, but it's not the same story. So as my former colleague Jeanette Rodriguez at Seattle University, who's written this classic book on it, you can see here, highlights that this is a story that belongs in the context of indigenous people in Latin America. And it's a very different story, different context than John of Patmos writing in the 1st century. And here's a classic image of that in color, so you can see that more closely. And when we look at those images together, they're really not the same. They happen to involve a woman, and because chapter 12 is often associated with Mary, people make that leap. But they're really different stories. So perhaps if you're not deeply familiar with the Bible, or you're not coming from a Catholic tradition, and you picture a woman and a dragon, you might picture this from, of course, Game of Thrones, Daenerys and her dragon. This is a little different relationship there when her dragon is like her pet and warrior companion than what we see in this confrontation here. So here's one modern image from the Filipino artist Mike Emshin, and I'm providing the link to his site there so you can see more of his work. And I like this because it really shows the drama and really the almost unimaginable nature of this dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. And as several scholars have noted laconically, how do you distribute 10 horns across 7 heads? So an artist had to do that here. And I thank Mike Emshin, who I don't know, that for this image. So many images in our head. Rather than carry those around, I encourage us to pay close attention to the text itself so we can discern that for ourselves. Another aspect of this we have to address right away is, are we talking about an individual woman who can be identified, an individual woman who's mythological, or a woman who's a representative of a collective? And I'd really like to suggest that this woman here, clothed with the sun, as my note there says, as Israel or Zion, not the historical Israelites, but God's chosen people from whom the Messiah will come, according to Sweet. That's one version of it. Another version of it is that she's the followers of Jesus. She's, in other words, the embodiment of the people who witnessed in the last scene in chapter 11, and we'll see that collectively again. If we're concerned about the fact that she's singular, well, of course, Babylon is singular and New Jerusalem are singular as women, but obviously represent collective entities as cities. So since we just saw the question of Jerusalem and the temple, and we're going to see that again as we go, it should not be surprising that one way to identify this woman is as the community of Jesus' disciples. What I'm not going to try to do, as some scholars insist on doing, is try to answer this. Why can't it be multiple? John is certainly writing in a poetic, apocalyptic way that allows for multiple readings, just like his Jewish ancestors, Hebrew scripture writer ancestors, so often did. It's the Western rational mind that wants to interpret these down to an answer, and perhaps that's limiting the beautiful imagery and powerful construction that he's doing, that brings forth Hebrew scripture and images from his own culture and allows readers whenever and wherever to hear that as they hear it. But one thing that we do have to do is pay close attention to the language itself, which is consistent here. So one aspect, in addition to how the larger chapter is structured that you see there, and that E, F, G, F, E chiasm, only lettered that way because it's part of the bigger one, is that it's framed by the conflict between the dragon and the woman, but it's centered on war in heaven, which means these entire 3 chapters plus are centered on this war in heaven. And as we saw last time, there are different places in this where it says the victory's been won one way or the other. And again, these are simultaneous rather than sequential. So let's not worry about that in particular. But these 4 verses are framed not so much in a chiasm, although Lou wants to make an ABB chiasm out of the first 3 verses. I'd suggest instead this version of 2 sets of 3 and then the confrontation at the end. So verses 1 and 2 start off with the introduction of the sign. This one, a great sign or portent, as we see in the New Revised Standard, in the sky. The description of the woman with a crown on her head and moon under her feet, and the state and activity of the woman as pregnant and crying in agony. And then it jumps in verse 3 to simply another sign or another portent. Notice this one's not described as great, but is described in the sky or in the heaven. The description of the dragon with diadems and horns on the head. and then the activity of the dragon sweeping stars to the earth. So 2 parallel signs, and then verse 4, B is the confrontation there with the dragon confronting the woman, as we saw in the visual images. So that's setting up what will follow. So let's look a little more closely at the imagery, again, as we've been doing throughout, noting how much of this echoes Hebrew Scripture. So the woman clothed with the sun, literally with the sun wrapped around her. Parabolo means to throw around, and we'll see that's a variation on the theme of throwing that we're seeing, that we'll see throughout this section here, longer than beyond the section we're going to look at today. So wrapped with the sun and with the moon under her feet. Images of power, the under her feet, as you can see there on the right side, echoing the image from Psalm 8:6. You have given humans dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet. And we've seen various examples of the 24 elders falling on their faces at the feet of the one on the throne, and different people standing. And so we've seen different body positions as expressions of power here. Perhaps given the Babylonian context of the story, if not the cultural context of the audience, which of course is the Roman cultural context, the sun and the moon were often seen as divinities, especially the moon in the Babylonian world. But of course the sun as Apollo was very important in the Roman world as well. And that's what's led some scholars to see this whole story, especially Adela Yarbrough Collins, as John's variation on myths from the Greco-Roman world, of goddesses giving birth to children and being pursued by enemies. More recent scholarship has challenged that sense of borrowing from the Greco-Roman mythological world, figuring that A, John has no interest in the Greco-Roman mythical world, and B, this can easily be explained, as I'm trying to show you here in this chart, from imagery from Hebrew Scripture. So even though there are parallels in the Greco-Roman world, it doesn't prove that John is adapting those. Why would he feel the need to do that when so much of what he's doing is coming from Hebrew Scripture? Again, that's not a question I feel like you need to answer any more than a modern poet in our world has to parse what were their influences, how much came out of their unconscious, and how much came out of specific cultural things around them. We certainly know, though, that John is deeply rooted in Hebrew Scripture, so we're going to stay with that. So, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. The 12 stars echoes other aspects of 12 we've seen, and primarily for the 12 tribes of Israel, or the 12 disciples or apostles of Jesus. So let's look briefly back at that. We see in chapter 7, we saw from the tribes 12,000 sealed from each of those tribes there, and then replaced by the 144,000. By the countless, the 144,000 replaced by the countless multitudes. So, but with its root in 12,000 from each tribe. And at the end here we see New Jerusalem with 12 angels and 12 gates, names of the 12 tribes. So it ought not to be surprising here that this woman with a crown of 12 stars, that the stars would be parallel to the tribes. And that's something like what we see in Genesis 37:9, not as the tribes but as people in young Joseph's arrogant dream that he tells to his family about the moon and the sun and the stars bowing down to him, representing his family, his parents, and his siblings there, but certainly of an image of power. So she was pregnant here in Gestry. That's used only of Mary in the New Testament as a human person, but as Molina notes, and he's in his book is all about making this about sky figures, which is the constellations, sees this as an expression of the constellation of the pregnant woman, known from both Mesopotamian and other Mediterranean traditions. And that may be too. It may be there's an actual image in the sky that represents a story that the people have, just like many of the constellations have stories behind them, apart from the actual constellations. So she's crying out in birth pangs, and you can see the places where that word is used there, in the agony of giving birth. Notice the detail of this description of this woman in the sky, pregnant in agony. And then we see, might as well go back to the Hebrew Scripture before we go to the next sign. So this image of Israel as pregnant, we see that from Isaiah 26:17 as one example, including the agony here, like a woman with child who writhes and cries out in her pangs when she is near her time, so were we because of you, O Yahweh, highlighting that image is being used as a simile about the people of Israel there. And then we switch to the great red dragon. Then another sign appeared in the heaven, a great red dragon. And notice it appears here as if we're familiar with dragons, and if we've read the Hebrew Scripture, we are. You can see on the right side Pharaoh likened to a dragon. Of course, that would be more specifically a crocodile, sprawling in the midst of its channels. But in the Hebrew, in the Greek, drakon is the word word that's used there. So there for the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and then also in Jeremiah for King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, has devoured me, he has crushed me, he has made me an empty vessel, he has swallowed me. Here the New RSV has like a monster, but in the Septuagint it's Dracon again. So dragon used a couple of times, and among many times, but always associated with powerful people and human power's relationship with nature and creation here. So whether that's translating from the Hebrew scripture Leviathan, or translating Tanim from the Hebrew, as you can see down here from like Isaiah 27, or Leviathan as the big wild animal. Either way, we see dragons there. Again, not understood as mythological creatures, but as simply a Greek translation of existing animals, although sometimes in mythological or poetic settings. So then we have the 7 heads and the 10 horns. And as I noted at the beginning, many scholars wonder about how those are meant to be distributed. But the issue isn't that. The issue is the literary connection with Daniel, as we see here. We can, in my note on the bottom left, you can see that we see here the dragon has 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 diadems. And in chapter 13, the beast will have 10 horns, 7 heads, and 10 diadems. So in different order, but parallel with more diadems. When we get to the beast, we'll see what those differences are. But we see the image of horns as a sign of power has its root there in Daniel 7:7, and repeated again later in that chapter 20 and 24. After this, I saw in the visions by night a 4th beast, which is to say Antiochus, which is to say the Seleucid Empire, and one of those horns becomes Antiochus Epiphanes. And so 10 horns representing a series of kings. Many scholars wanting to count these, just like wanting to count the 7 mountains. Again, it's a number of wholeness. It's not a matter of 7 specific heads or 10 specific horns. These are numbers of wholeness, echoing Hebrew scripture and other things as well. The diadems are parallel to the crown, and so competing for power. So this woman with a crown of 12 stars, and the dragon with 7 diadems on its head. So presumably 1 diadem on each head, not 7 diadems on each head, not 49 diadems. And so here they are arrayed, almost like David and Goliath standing against each other. And then we reach our final verse for today. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven. That third might remind us of the trumpets, where the thirds were happening in chapters 8 and 9 here. But it's also a possible allusion to the Book of the Watchers. And we'll see examples of the Book of the Watchers when we see the war in heaven as well. The image of the tail here is what swept, echoes both from the tail of the locust horses that we saw in chapter 9, but also with the image from Isaiah 9:14, where the tail for the false prophets and the head of the leaders of the people. So in this sense here, that the dragon representing false prophecy, as we'll see come out more explicitly later with the images of foul beasts like foul spirits like frogs in chapter 16. So 1/3 of these stars of heaven is not so much that he's destroying it as is bringing them with him. This, according to the Enoch story of the rebellious angels in heaven, although we'll see in a moment that he's going to be thrown out of the sky, thrown out of heaven, would be bringing some of his fellow angels down to earth to wreak havoc. So there we get to the throwing image, and it's interesting, I think, is so often key words that are played out many times in a given passage, but translations often don't show that. So here we see the Greek verb balo, to throw. Of the 28 times in Revelation, 8 of them are in these verses from 12:4 to 12:16. 12:4 is the only one we're looking at today, but I just want to note as we do that you'll see as those come up ahead. The ones in blue are things that the dragon is doing, and the ones in black are the dragon being thrown down. So images of power here as we go through this, of forcible movement, and we see that with the violent tail, and there's the image from Isaiah. And then finally, the confrontation in verse 4 here, which many scholars see as connected with Genesis 3:15, even though the language isn't the same. The classic, I will put enmity between you, the serpent, and the woman, who later becomes Eve, and between your offspring and hers, he will strike your head and you will strike his heel. The striking of head and heel is not exactly what happens here, but many think that John's image here is playing out the larger story. And of course, it's because of a verse a little later in chapter 12 that we associate the dragon and the devil and Satan with the serpent in Genesis 3 in the Garden of Eden. There's no association like that in the Hebrew Scripture or anywhere else in the New Testament except for right here. So certainly John has the Garden of Eden story in mind when he's thinking of the dragon and Satan and the devil and the snake. Whether he has a specific image or not, we don't know, but as the story unfolds, we'll see if that makes sense of it. So our scene is set up. We're going to see next time the woman will begin to escape and the earth will be what protects her, and we'll continue our story then. See you then. Bye-bye.